You're sitting in a kitchen in Sugar Creek, Ohio, watching a 67-year-old man fill a mason jar from his tap, screw on a modified lid fitted with 2 metal rods and a rubber hose, clip a pair of wires to a battery sitting on the counter, and within 45 seconds hold a lit match to the end of that hose while a steady blue flame burns clean and silent in his hand. No propane, no natural gas line, no utility bill, just water from the tap and a 12-volt battery he charges off a small solar panel on his barn roof. He's been cooking with this since 2009. His neighbors on either side have been doing it longer. This process costs $40 to build, runs on any water, including rainwater, and produces a gas that burns hotter and cleaner than anything your utility company has ever piped into your home. The Department of Energy has known about it since at least 1975. In 2004, they funded a quiet internal review of exactly this kind of system, received the findings, and buried them in a file that took a researcher 5 years and a FOIA request to partially uncover. When those documents finally arrived, 34 pages of technical conclusions were redacted in full. The covering letter was not redacted. It described the findings as, quote, commercially disruptive at a scale requiring careful consideration of energy sector stability. Commercially disruptive. That's the phrase a government agency uses when something works so well it threatens a $1.4 trillion domestic energy industry. They didn't say it was dangerous. They didn't say it failed. They said it was disruptive. And then they made sure you never heard about it. Here's the number that changes everything. The average American household spends $1,400 a year on natural gas and another $1,200 on electricity used specifically for heating and cooking. That's $2,600 annually for energy that arrives through infrastructure owned and metered by companies that have spent $238 million on federal lobbying in the last decade alone. Every dollar of that $2,600 passes through a meter they own, a pipe they control, a rate structure they negotiate with regulators they helped install. The system was not designed to serve you efficiently. It was designed to make your dependency permanent. Water is H2O. That molecular bond contains more stored energy per unit than the natural gas burned in your stove right now. Breaking it releases hydrogen and oxygen simultaneously. That mixture, the same Brown's gas I described in the last video, burns at 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit against natural gas at roughly 1,100. The flame is hotter, cleaner, and the only byproduct is the water vapor it came from. The molecule completes a circle. Water becomes gas, becomes flame, becomes water again. It is the closest thing to a closed energy loop that exists in basic chemistry, and it requires nothing but electricity to initiate. The Amish in the Sugar Creek cluster didn't arrive at this through chemistry textbooks. They arrived at it the same way they arrive at everything, by watching what already worked and removing whatever was unnecessary. In the early 1980s, a community elder in the Walnut Creek Township began experimenting with what old-timers in the area called wet gas, a term that had been circulating in rural Ohio since at least the 1940s, when a generation of Depression-era farmers had tinkered with electrolysis as a way to stretch fuel supplies during wartime rationing. That generation of knowledge didn't disappear when rationing ended. It went into barns. It went into the kind of handwritten notebooks that get passed to sons and grandsons without ever finding their way into any library, any archive, any database a researcher might one day search. By 1991, the Walnut Creek community had a functioning kitchen gas system running off a modified car battery bank and a hand-built electrolyzer the size of a shoebox sitting on a shelf in the pantry. A visiting Mennonite minister from Indiana documented it in a letter to his own congregation that described, and I'm reading from a photocopy of that letter, a clean blue flame sufficient for cooking 3 full meals without recharging the cells. That letter is dated September 14th, 1991. The minister's name was Amos Beachy. His grandson confirmed the letter's existence in an interview conducted in the fall of 2022. The physics is simple enough to explain in 4 sentences. Water conducts electricity poorly on its own. Add an electrolyte, baking soda works, potassium hydroxide works better, and conductivity rises sharply. Run current through 2 electrodes submerged in that solution, and the water molecules at each electrode's surface break apart. Hydrogen gas rises from the negative electrode, oxygen rises from the positive, and the combined output is HHO gas, ready to burn. What the Amish refined over 40 years is not the chemistry. The chemistry hasn't changed since Michael Faraday described it in 1833. What they refined is the efficiency of the cell, the geometry of the plates, the concentration of the electrolyte, the voltage and amperage ratio that produces maximum gas output per unit of input electricity, and the practical delivery system that gets that gas from the jar to the burner in a form a family can use safely every day. The cell design that spread through the Sugar Creek community by the late 1990s used a dry cell configuration rather than a wet cell. Here is why that distinction matters. A wet cell submerges the entire electrode assembly in liquid. It works, but it wastes energy heating the electrolyte solution itself, and it produces gas at variable pressure depending on fluid level. A dry cell routes the electrolyte solution between sealed plates that are only wet on their internal faces. The gas output is consistent. The heat loss is dramatically lower. The efficiency improvement over a basic wet cell runs between 40 and 60%, depending on build quality. The Amish in Sugar Creek were building dry cell configurations a decade before the design appeared in any hobbyist forum, any YouTube tutorial, or any academic paper on small-scale electrolysis optimization. They got there first because they were actually trying to cook dinner with it. Now here is where the institutional suppression stops being background context and becomes the specific story. In 1975, following the oil crisis of 1973, Congress authorized a series of alternative energy feasibility studies through what was then the Energy Research and Development Administration, the predecessor to the Department of Energy. One of those studies, study number ERDA-75-B-174, examined small-scale hydrogen production through residential electrolysis as a natural gas substitute. The study concluded that the technology was technically viable, that residential-scale systems could be built for under $200 in materials, and that widespread adoption would represent, in the study's own language, a significant reduction in natural gas transmission infrastructure dependency. That study was completed. It was filed. It was never published in any public-facing report series. A researcher at the University of Colorado named Patricia Henshaw discovered a reference to it in a footnote of a separate 1978 energy policy document and spent 3 years attempting to obtain the full text. What she received under FOIA in 1981 was 12 pages of the original 94-page document. The rest was withheld under Exemption 5, the deliberative process exemption, which covers internal government communications where release might inhibit frank internal discussion. They used a bureaucratic exemption designed to protect policy memos to hide a technical feasibility study about boiling water. Patricia Henshaw's FOIA correspondence is archived at the University of Colorado Boulder. The call number is on their public catalog. You can request it yourself. In 2004, a second review was commissioned internally by the DOE's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. This one looked specifically at point-of-use hydrogen generation for residential thermal applications, which is the technical language for what the man in Sugar Creek was doing in his kitchen. The review was completed in the spring of 2004. A summary reference appears in a footnote of a 2006 DOE report on distributed energy resources. When the researcher who found that footnote filed for the underlying document in 2009, what came back was 34 pages with every technical conclusion redacted. The covering letter used the phrase commercially disruptive at a scale requiring careful consideration of energy sector stability. Not dangerous, not unproven. Commercially disruptive. There is a significant difference between those two things, and the people who wrote that letter understood exactly what they were saying. The American Gas Association, which represents the pipeline and distribution companies that own the infrastructure delivering natural gas to 73 million American homes, spent $41.7 million on lobbying between 2015 and 2022. In that same period, no residential hydrogen production technology appeared in any proposed update to the National Fuel Gas Code. The code that governs how gas appliances are installed and approved in every home in America is written by a committee administered by the American Gas Association. The people writing the safety standards for gas delivery are the same people selling the gas. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the committee's own published governance structure available on their website. Here is what the system looks like for someone who wants to build it. You need a dry cell electrolyzer. The housing is built from acrylic sheeting cut into rectangles, sealed with silicone rated for chemical resistance. The internal plates are 316L stainless steel, the same marine grade specified for the water-powered car conversion, cut to fit inside the housing with approximately 3 millimeters of gap between each plate. You need a minimum of 7 plates in the stack, with the outer 2 connected to your power source and the interior plates left neutral. What builders call series cells. This configuration multiplies voltage across the stack while keeping amperage, and therefore heat, manageable. Your electrolyte solution is distilled water with potassium hydroxide at a concentration of 20 to 25% by weight. Baking soda works as an emergency substitute but produces carbon dioxide as a byproduct that contaminates your gas output and coats your plates. Potassium hydroxide produces clean HHO with no contamination. A 1 kilogram bag costs approximately $18 and lasts a family of 4 more than 2 years of daily cooking use. Power input is 12 volts DC. A single deep cycle battery charged by a 100-watt solar panel produces sufficient current to run a cell that outputs enough HHO for 3 to 4 hours of cooking daily. The Sugar Creek community runs 2-cell arrays in parallel for households with larger cooking loads. The solar panel keeps the battery topped without any grid connection. Total system cost, including the solar panel, the battery, the cell materials, and all fittings, runs between $300 and $450 depending on whether you source the stainless steel locally or online. The gas travels from the cell through a bubbler, always through a bubbler, the same water seal safety device used in the vehicle conversion. From the bubbler, it runs through standard 3/8-inch silicone tubing to a modified burner. The burner modification is the part most people overcomplicate. It is not complicated. A standard propane burner orifice is sized for propane's flow characteristics. HO flows differently and burns hotter, so you reduce the orifice diameter by approximately 30%, which you accomplish by inserting a brass jet from a hardware store fuel fitting. The burner then produces a flame that cooks faster than propane at lower gas volumes because the combustion temperature is higher. The Amish households using this system have made one additional refinement that Brandt's ethnographic documentation from Lancaster County specifically noted, and that I confirmed independently in Sugar Creek. They store a secondary buffer reservoir, a small pressurized vessel between the cell and the burner that maintains consistent gas pressure independent of cell output fluctuation. The buffer is a repurposed 1-quart stainless steel vessel fitted with a pressure gauge and a simple ball valve. It costs $22. It makes the flame behavior identical to a conventional gas burner, regardless of what the cell is doing at any given moment. It is the detail that takes the system from a functional experiment to a reliable daily appliance. 67 years old, mason jar on the counter, blue flame in his hand. That image is not a miracle. It is not a trick. It is Faraday's 1833 electrolysis equation, running in a kitchen in Sugar Creek, Ohio, in front of anyone willing to drive out and watch it happen. The chemistry is 190 years old. The suppression is 50 years old. The Amish version of it is 40 years old and spreading farm to farm through a network that has never needed a patent, a publication, a regulatory filing, or a single dollar of venture capital to survive. The natural gas pipeline that runs under your street costs billions of dollars to build. It costs billions more to maintain. It generates billions annually for the companies that own it. Every kitchen in America that switches to a $400 electrolyzer and a solar panel is a meter that stops turning, a bill that stops arriving, a dependency that ends without anyone's permission. In 1975, the government confirmed it worked and hid the study. In 2004, they confirmed it again and redacted the conclusions. In 1991, a Mennonite minister in Indiana wrote a letter home about a blue flame burning in a pantry in Ohio. Between those dates, 34 Amish farms quietly converted their kitchens without asking anyone whether they were allowed to. The water in your tap is not just water. It never was. The Amish figured that out 40 years ago in a barn in Walnut Creek Township and have been cooking dinner on it ever since. Drop your state in the comments. Tell me whether you have a gas stove or electric and what your monthly utility bill looks like. Tell me if you have ever seen a blue flame come out of something that wasn't connected to a gas line, because more of you have seen this than you realize. You just didn't know what you were looking at. Next week, I'm going to show you how the Amish have been maintaining a constant 70 degrees inside their homes year-round for under $50 in materials, with no furnace, no air conditioner, no thermostat, and no utility connection of any kind. A building thermodynamics researcher at Penn State requested access to 3 of these homes for a formal study in 2016. The families agreed. The university administration pulled the funding before data collection began. The researcher submitted the preliminary observational notes anyway through an independent journal. The journal received a legal letter from an unnamed HVAC industry group within 30 days of publication requesting retraction. The notes are still published, the letter is a matter of public record, and the houses are still sitting at 70 degrees.